Would you take your Bibles and turn to the book of Acts, chapter 25? We began studying the book of Acts last January. And the book of Acts really documents the expansion of Christianity from a small group in Jerusalem to expand out throughout the Roman Empire. It is exciting to see the spread of God's Word and His faithfulness to His Word as it's proclaimed in new places. As we come to chapter 25, I'm going to read the first 12 verses. 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and leaders of the Jews gave him a report against Paul. They appealed to him and requested, as a favor to them against Paul, to have him transferred to Jerusalem. They were, in fact, planning an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So he said, "Let those of you who have the authority come down with me. If there's anything wrong about the man, let them accuse him." After he had stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. The next day he took a seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he arrived, the Jews who had gone down from Jerusalem, surrounded him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. Paul said in his defense, "I have in no way committed an offense against the law of the Jews, or against the temple, or against the emperor." But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, asked Paul, "Do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and be tried there before me on these charges?" Paul said, "I am appealing to the emperor's tribunal. This is where I should be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you very well know. Now, if I am in the wrong and have committed something for which I deserve to die, I'm not trying to escape death. But if there's nothing to their charges against me, no one can turn them over to me, or turn me over to them. I appeal to the emperor." Then Festus, after he had conferred with his council, replied, "You have appealed to the emperor you will go." Compared actually to the account before Felix, which we read about last week in chapter 24, and the account before the account of the trial before King Herod Agrippa, which will come later in chapter 26, this narrative here is relatively brief in terms of Paul's trial. Yet it's really worth looking at the different parties, the different characters in this trial. There are 3 individuals or bodies in this. There's the accusers, there's the judge, and there's the accused. And let's look at each one of those. The accusers, first of all, the Jews. And I think in this passage, particularly, this group of people illustrate what I would call the corrupting effects of religion. When one is not actually in touch with God. The corrupting effects of religion. You know, we tend to look at religion as a good thing, but it can be very corrupting. And when we think about the Jews here, we can see the progress of the corruption that's taking place. If the life of God is not actually present in the worshiper, his religion can become hypocrisy. It can become a veneer. And it can be used to do some things that are obviously evil. All we have to do is trace history back, and we can see that history is filled with examples where some of the worst things that have been done in history have been done by people who claim to be doing the will of God. We can see it today. The Jews here were plotting to murder Paul, to ambush him and to murder him. We read that in our passage here. Now, in their own law, in Exodus chapter 20, a part of the 10 Commandments says, "You shall not murder." They were actually violating their own criminal law here, which provided safeguards for people who were accused of a capital offense. They were going against that. They were doing everything possible to avoid the due process of law in this case. And yet they were supposed to be upholders of the law. You can actually see the growth of corruption. Back in chapter 23, you might recall that it was the zealots who had come to the Jewish leaders and said, here's what we'd like you to do. If you would just move Paul from one place to the other here, it says actually that this group of people, the zealots, had bound themselves to an oath that they wouldn't eat or drink for 40 days, or they wouldn't eat or drink anything until they had actually killed Paul. And they came to the leaders asking them to notify the tribune to bring Paul down on the pretext of making a more thorough examination. And they said to these Jewish leaders, when he's being transported, we're going to ambush him and kill him. These were the zealots. But now, a couple chapters later, it's these Jewish leaders themselves who are plotting to ambush Paul and kill him. This is how wickedness spreads and why we must always be on guard against it. It's easy for religious people to go astray and to claim God's authority for their own disobedience. It's easy to do that. Secondly, we have the judge here, Governor Porcius Festus. He was the replacement, you recall, from Felix. Felix had been recalled by Nero because he had been corrupt, and Festus is his replacement. The noticeable thing about Festus is his unwillingness to delay decisions. Remember, Felix was one who delayed, put it off. Festus is just the opposite. He's only in the province 3 days in Caesarea, and he immediately goes, after being there 3 days, he goes from Caesarea, which is the seat of the tribune, and goes to Jerusalem. He wanted to find out what he was facing. So he goes there, talks to the Jews, spends some time there, and he's there for 8 or 10 days, and then he goes back to Caesarea, and the very next day after he gets back, he convenes this trial of the Apostle Paul. So I guess we can commend him for that. He was one to take action, do something right away. He had one serious flaw, though. He wanted to please people. And specifically in this case, he wanted to please the Jews, because it was in his best interest that the Jews be happy. His job is to maintain law and order and peace in the area. But this was a legal matter here. Any giving of favors in this situation was really a perversion of justice and the abuse of an innocent man. And we have to think that Festus really knew that Paul was innocent, because he had obviously looked at the record. Festus had left a record of his examination of Paul. There was the letter from Lysias, the tribune, the Roman soldier, Roman tribune. Lysias sent a letter to Festus explaining how we're going to move Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea because there was a plot on his life. All of this Festus would have known. It was in the record. And yet, Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, compromised. How many right actions have been bartered away because of those who knew what was right wanted to please somebody, or at least not offend somebody? You know, that happens all the time. Well, we don't want to offend anybody here. We want to keep everybody happy. And as a result, compromise what we know to be the right thing. It's not just something that happens in the world either. It's done by Christians and in the church. The trial is actually told in very brief language here, verses 7 and 8. Paul, in his response, mentions the charges, and there are three of them. The first is heresy, really. He says, I have in no way committed an offense against the law. That is the law, the religious law, the law of the Jewish law. I haven't committed heresy. The second charge was sacrilege, doing something against the temple. He says, I haven't done that either. And the third is treason against the emperor. Those are close to the charges that were brought against Jesus. Not observing the Sabbath correctly, prophesying the destruction of the temple, making himself a king. You know, and these accusations are made against believers all over the world today. In virtually any country, people feel that people are actually under attack. Christians are under attack. In Sudan, Somalia, Eritrea, in China, now in Mali, North Africa, Christians are being persecuted. And it's these same kind of things. They're accused of disregarding the laws or customs of their nation, which would be the case if you live in a Muslim country. To not be a Muslim is to disregard the laws and customs of the nation. Well, Christians will try to obey the country's laws wherever they are, but they will not go against God's law when God's law is contrary to a country's laws. Another charge is, well, they don't adhere to the religion of the people among whom they live. Well, in fact, the early Christians were accused of being atheists because they denied the existence of all these pagan gods. And the other is that they're guilty of treason. And this happens often today in countries where Christians are being persecuted. And it happened during the Cold War. Christians behind the Iron Curtain, accused of being spies. Christians will not acknowledge the ultimate sovereignty of any state, but the sovereignty of God. These charges go on all the time in our world today. And we really do need to keep our persecuted brothers and sisters in prayer across the world. Paul said he had not done any of these things, at least not in ways that would bring him in danger of a Roman court. And he said the Jews could not prove these charges. But Festus wanted to do the Jews a favor. And again, it's hard to suggest that Festus had done this from pure motives. We can't believe that he hadn't heard about the plot to assassinate Paul. And then we come to Paul, the accused. Paul was the only one who actually emerged victorious here. He was innocent of the charges, and he depended upon God. He trusted God in all circumstances. You and I face a world in which we come under pressure sometimes because of our faith. We live in a world that has a value system that is hostile to God's standards. And we're pressured to compromise or to deny what we know to be the truth. How do we stand up under that kind of pressure? People say, well, you have to go along to get along today. Well, let me suggest three things here that we can apply in our own lives as we come under pressure to compromise. The first is know that God is sovereign. What does it mean that God is sovereign? It means that God rules and reigns over all things. He is over all circumstances. What that means is that even if things do not work out You know,